Welcome to Standard 5C. For this presentation, we'll head to East Asia around the year 1500 and look specifically at China during a period known as the Ming Dynasty and Japan during a period known as the Tokugawa Shogunate. The essential question we're trying to answer in this presentation is how did China and Japan both attempt to limit the influence of European merchants? The essential understanding, it's a little bit strange for us today, is that China and Japan did both try and limit how much influence outside traders, specifically European merchants, had on their countries. We live in a world today where so many of the things that we have come from these two countries. You look out at the parking lot of the school and you see all the Japanese-made cars. Looking around my classroom, my hole puncher, stapler, rulers, all these things are made in China. So it seems a little strange to think that 500 years ago, both of these countries in different ways were trying to limit how much contact they had with the world beyond their borders. We'll take a look at both of these countries separately. We'll start with China. The idea that Europeans have long had demand for Chinese goods. Going back through the centuries, whether it was tea or porcelain, Europeans were interested in increasing contact with China. China didn't really always feel the same way about that contact. They didn't feel a similar desire to increase trade with Europe. But whether it was traders like Marco Polo or the merchants who traveled the Silk Roads from Europe to China, there's been this demand in Europe for increased contact with China. As we mentioned, China didn't always feel the same way. During Ming Dynasty China, there was an official government policy of trying to control foreign influence and control foreign trade. The Chinese emperors had a good bit of control over the economy of the country, and they tried to limit the influence that outsiders had on China. That wasn't always the case. Early in the Ming Dynasty, the Ming emperors were very interested in increasing contact. They sent out explorers, most famous of whom was the Chinese explorer Zheng He. And he went out in the early 1400s, went on a series of 7 voyages from China across the Indian Ocean, came in contact with India, the Middle East, the east coast of Africa, and brought back on these huge treasure ships that the Chinese built all sorts of goods and products back to the emperor. We see in this diagram just how massive these ships were. In comparison, the Chinese treasure ships to the European ships of the time, this diagram shows us Columbus's ships in comparison to the ships of Zheng He. And we can see that the European ships, and this was about 70 years later, the European ship was about 4 times smaller than the Chinese ships. Okay, so just to give us a sense that the Chinese explorers were out there and they were looking to make contact and see what outside countries and empires had. The chronicles tell us that Zheng He even brings home to the emperor a giraffe from the east coast of Africa. The emperors, though, after around 1430, make the decision that even though some of this stuff is really cool, that there's nothing that the outside world had that was really worth the time and effort of China. And so they're going to close China down. Okay, they're going to destroy the treasure ships and pretty much limit all further exploration and all further contact that the outside world had with China. Okay, after this period, China begins a policy of creating foreign enclaves. An enclave refers to an area where things are different than in the surrounding area. Okay, if we think of letter A and letter B being 2 different countries, we would say that letter C would be an enclave within country A. Okay, we could look at it as silly example here. We got a bunch of green apples. The red would be an enclave of red apples in this big sea of green apples. Or the blue fish is an enclave surrounded by the goldfish. For the Chinese, their policy was to create these enclaves where the Europeans were kind of confined. The outsiders who were from beyond China's borders would have a little area where they could trade, but they weren't free to go trading throughout all of China. Okay, and this was really China's policy, to create and contain these little enclaves where they allowed foreigners in but kept them under tight control. Okay, we see here on a map of China, the Chinese created enclaves. One of the early ones was the Chinese city of Guangzhou, or as the Europeans called it, Canton. The picture here shows the factories and the warehouses that they were allowed, and we see the various flags of European countries, even an American flag there, showing the Chinese allowing trade by outside countries to take place there, but not beyond that area. They also allowed specific countries to set up enclaves. Macau in southeastern China was a Portuguese enclave. The problem for China, though, is that these enclaves over time began to expand. We see, for example, Macau, Portuguese influence in the street signs. It wasn't just Chinese. We start to see the Portuguese language come in. We see in this example here the Portuguese religion, Christianity, coming in to China, and we see here in a painting in a church in Macau, this would be a Mary and Jesus painting with a very Chinese appearance. This is kind of an example. China found it more and more difficult to control these enclaves. Okay, we're going to see here Japan did things a little bit differently under the Tokugawa Shogunate. And a shogunate refers to a system of government headed by a position called a shogun. Just like a monarchy has a monarch, a shogunate has a shogun as the leader. There was an emperor. We can see on the right-hand side here the social hierarchy had an emperor at the top, but the real control was in this military leader called a shogun. Okay, we can see here a little more specifically, up at the top of the system was the emperor. But the emperor, as it says here, was a figurehead. And a figurehead is somebody who's more of a symbolic leader. They don't really have the real control. You can almost think about on a team, let's say a professional sports team. Maybe there's a really high-paid athlete. So you have the coach who's really the head of the team, but that athlete really is even more powerful than the coaches. In the case of Japan, the emperor was the coach, but the star player was the shogun. The shogun was the real control and the real power in Japan. The other thing to note about this social system was who's at the bottom. Okay, the merchants, the business class was at the bottom of this society. And that goes to show how Japan was able to limit trade. If the merchants were higher up the social ladder, trade would have been more important to Japan at this time. Again, it seems very strange to us today, given that Japan is one of the big trading countries in the world. But at this time, under the Tokugawa Shogunate, the merchants were way down at the bottom. The feeling was that the merchants profited off of the work of other people. Okay, that the artisans and the peasant farmers did their own work. The merchants, the traders made their money selling the things that other people made. So the business people, the merchants, really didn't have a lot of influence. And so the shogun is going to really clamp down and really limit trade. Okay, we move on to our second piece of essential knowledge. So under the Tokugawa Shogunate, Japan adopted a policy of isolation, of sakaku, which was the policy of limiting all foreign influence. During this period, it was illegal under penalty of death for the Japanese to leave Japan or for outsiders to enter Japan. There were stories of sailors who shipwrecked off the coast of Japan being killed on the beach. Japanese merchants who tried to leave Japan to trade could be executed as well. The Tokugawa Shogunate, in other words, they really tried to cut Japan off from all foreign contact. Part of this was the ability to cut off because Japan geographically was an island or a series of islands, and that made it a little easier for the Tokugawa Shogunate to limit any foreign contact with Japan, and also to limit Japanese contact with the outside world. So we can kind of, we see various things then develop in Japan. An example of this would be a style of theater called kabuki theater, which is very distinctly Japanese. Okay, it really doesn't have any similarities to Korea, China, any of its neighboring countries. Because Japan is cut off and isolated, Japan really does develop a very distinct culture, even from the surrounding nearby countries. Okay, we can think of China and Japan, just to wrap this up, as these two doors. The door on the left would be China during this time. China didn't open the door completely. They kept the door mainly closed. But by allowing the enclaves, by allowing some foreign trade, they kept the door open a little bit. Japan, on the other hand, is the door on the right. Japan is totally locked down, bars, gates, heavy locks. They really tried during this time to minimize completely all foreign influence. And those are the main ideas we need to know for Standard 5C.